World War I began in August 1914 when Germany invaded France in a quest to expand their empire. Britain, France, and Germany all thought it would be a short, fast, mobile war. At the front, supporting the thousands of troops, was the horse-drawn field artillery. Both sides had similar weapons, but the British favored this, the 18-pounder field gun, the infantry killer. The Germans went for the field howitzer, the gun and bunker buster. Backed up by heavy artillery, these two guns came head-to-head at the beginning of the war on the fields of northern France. The clash would prove their worth and change battle tactics forever. Since the time of Napoleon, wars had been fought the same way, armies engaging face-to-face in a two-dimensional ground battle. But this was all about to change. In 1914, the Germans, French, and British had similar field guns, but very different tactics.
At the beginning of the First World War, the British, like other European armies, believed that there would be a war of mobility, which would be over very quickly. And that's what they equipped for, and that's what they trained for. So it was an army which would move around the battlefield very quickly, and consequently, artillery would have to be light, mobile, and rapid firing. The 18-pounder was horse-drawn and could keep up with a mobile army based really at the speed at which infantry could march.
March!
These soldiers from the Royal Artillery have restored the British 18-pounder, named after the shell it fired, which weighed 18 pounds.
80. 3800.
The 18-pounder would come into action with the infantry in the open and fire at targets which the infantry could see, but probably at a range the infantry couldn't hit.
It was a very, very successful field gun. It had a very high velocity, a very flat trajectory, good range, very good, very powerful shell.
But the 18-pounders were exposed to enemy fire because of the British tactic of having guns up front.
The most important thing was to support the infantry. And there was a cultural factor. Since on an exercise, everybody wanted to be seen to be, doing gallant deeds and seen to be in the thick of it, going forward to fire directly was clearly the best method of supporting the infantry. It looked better, and there are all kinds of interesting comments about the battery commander wanting to show dash and panache on exercise.
The 18-pounder, with its low, flat trajectory, firing at oncoming soldiers, was a highly effective infantry killer. The barrel of the gun could be raised to 16 degrees, limited only by the carriage on which it sat. The Germans had a different approach. The mobile field howitzer. It sent shells high into the air, exploding on impact, wiping out guns and fortresses.
Oh, Texas Bay!
The field howitzer first had a carriage which enabled it to fire up to an elevation of the tube of 40 degrees. This enabled the field howitzer to fire from behind a cover, that is a protecting hill where the enemy could neither see them nor hit them.
The design of the howitzer meant a different strategy. The German field howitzers were behind the infantry, firing high, a tactic called indirect fire. The men firing the concealed guns could not see their target. Meanwhile, the British 18-pounders were up front. They fired straight ahead, a tactic called direct fire. The tactics were different, and so was their ammunition.
18-pounder took a shrapnel shell like this, and its aim was basically to kill people. That was its raison d'etre. The idea was to burst the shell, send the contents flying forward from some point above and short of the target that you were trying to engage.
Designed to burst in the air and not on impact, the 18-pounder shell needed a timed fuse.
The fuse itself was a powder-burning time fuse, which has only graduated up to 22, which is about 22 seconds. And to set it to that maximum, it would limit us to about 5,500 yards, something like that.
The shell exits the barrel at 1,600 feet per second. Before setting the fuse, the gunners first calculated their distance from the enemy in order to determine how long the shell needed to be in the air before exploding. Most often, they aimed to explode the shrapnel burst about 90 feet above advancing troops. the 18-pounder shell cut them down like weeds.
It did it by having musket balls, about 150 of them roughly in the shell here. A time fuse in the front, time to go off in the air, just short of and above the infantry. The fuse sent a flash down through a central channel, ignited some gunpowder here in the base, which pushed against this pusher plate here, pushing all the balls forward, breaking the nose off, and the balls came shooting out the front. Because the shell was spinning, the balls actually came out in a cone shape, giving us quite a wide and long target effect, probably a couple of 100 yards typically. Bullets themselves, they're really old-fashioned musket balls, and therefore they're doing just the same damage as a rifle bullet. Not very pleasant.
The German approach was different. They were aiming for Allied guns and fortifications with high explosive shells.
The howitzer was able to fire a shell twice as heavy and containing more than twice as many of explosive, giving more effect in the target.
The shell created a concussive blast, which first sent out a huge shockwave, and then large pieces of shrapnel tore the target to pieces. The howitzer's high-angle lob trajectory sent shells up and over obstacles, forests, hills, and buildings, and down into trenches. The howitzer was not as effective as the 18-pounder against advancing infantry, but it could easily disable a British field gun, which was what the Germans wanted. Despite the howitzer's superior ability to destroy guns and fortresses, both guns used ammunition that served the purpose for which they were designed. But when it came to accuracy, the 18-pounder had the advantage with its direct fire.
Royal Artillery was perhaps the best practiced at firing shrapnel, and bursting shrapnel at the correct altitude was a skill, and the optimum altitude was between 20 and 30 meters above an advancing enemy infantry in the open.
Each gunner had a specific job. One relayed the coordinates of the enemy target to the team. Next, the other gunner set the range and elevation, then loaded the shell.
20 minutes left.
And actually, the thing the Royal Artillery was better at than any of his opponents was bursting shrapnel at the correct height, having estimated the range against the target. Because if you are trying to respond rapidly to a target you see in front of you, if you can instinctively estimate range by eye, you can get to the target immediately.
Ready!
And if you had, in the middle of a battle, some gunner officer saying, hang on a moment, getting out his map, working out how far away the target was, you might have lost the decisive opportunity to use the weapon to best effect.
Angle of sight, 20 minutes, elevation.
The first gunner puts the gun sights on the target.
Number 1 ranging, 3800.
The second gunner elevates the barrel so that the trajectory of the shell will go the distance to the target. The British thought that using maps to locate the target was cheating. It undermined their ability to judge distance by eye. But for the German howitzer, accuracy was more difficult. The gunners could not see their target, and without modern devices, they needed forward observers to pinpoint the enemy and relay the coordinates back.
It had to be done with the help of a telephone line, which first had to be installed, taking even more time before getting into action, or with the help of a whole chain of messengers, one running from the forward observer to the next, and then this one starting for the next 500 meters, and whatsoever. Radios only were introduced between the two wars.
This process of communicating was often slow and inaccurate.
You could not be sure that everything was correct until the forward observer cried, right on the target. But in most cases, he said, you are 300 meters too short, and then the settings, azimuth and elevation of the gun were changed accordingly. One more round fired, and if it was on the target, the rest of the battery also started firing so and so many rounds as had been ordered.
In areas of targeting and accuracy, the British 18-pounder had the advantage. But gunners also had to load and fire the gun as fast as possible. Again, the British field gun had the advantage. It was easier to use and faster to fire.
Assembly was not a problem. It came as one complete piece. Therefore, it was a case simply of taking it from the ammunition limber, loading it into the gun and firing it.
Ready! Number one. Fire!
Its quoted rate of fire was 8 rounds a minute. I've seen 20 actually mentioned, but I think probably 12 rounds would be a reasonable figure for a good, well-trained crew.
This rapid rate of fire was accomplished by an innovative mechanism that closed and sealed the breech.
We could internally thread the end of the barrel and then screw in a great big block. That would clearly take time. We wouldn't achieve much in the way of a rate of fire. But if we cut away half the screw threads inside the end of the barrel and half the screw threads on the breech block itself, we could then insert it, give it a half-turn twist, and it's locked. By operating a handle, the handle was so arranged that the first movement of the handle unlocked it, and then the second continuous movement swung the whole breech block clear to enable you to load the next cartridge. Throwing the handle back over again, first of all swung the block closed, and only when it was fully closed did it then turn this half-turn and lock itself.
Rapid fire may seem advantageous, but in World War I, it had a price. Loading the 18-pounder was heavy work. Each shell weighed 18 pounds. The soldier reloading the gun might have to repeat this task for half an hour at a time. Continuous firing wore out the barrels as well as the men. Loading the German howitzer was slower and more complicated. It came in 2 pieces, the shell and the charge, which propelled the shell from the gun over the calculated distance.
Howitzers are loaded in 2 stages. First, the shell is rammed home into the tube, and then the metal cartridge case is fitted with the number of charges which the firing table says will be necessary to reach to the target.
The distance was controlled by 2 factors, elevation and the amount of charge. The amount of the charge could be varied by removing bags of gunpowder from the cartridge. The fewer the bags, the shorter the distance the shell travels. Gunners used a firing table to determine the amount of propulsion needed. It all took time.
Ready!
The howitzer will only do 4, 6 at the most rounds per minute, but these of heavier caliber and more effect because of more explosive.
The howitzer was slower to aim, load, and fire than the 18-pounder, but its lob trajectory kept the gun hidden from the enemy, and the high-explosive shell devastated its targets. The 18-pounder shrapnel shell cut down the enemy in its sights, but out in the open, it ran the risk of not surviving the first battle. In August 1914, the German howitzer and the British 18-pounder met on the fields of northern France at the Battle of Le Cateau. The clash would determine how all future wars would be fought. For 3 weeks, the German army attacked through Belgium and France. By the 25th of August, the British Expeditionary Force was in retreat after a defeat at Mons. General Smith-Dorrien commanded the retreating battalions to stop for the night at a small town about 100 miles from Paris called Le Cateau.
During the course of the night, General Smith-Dorrien, the corps commander, visited his troops and assessed that they might find it difficult to get away from the Germans early the following morning. And certainly his generals said that their troops were done in after 3 days of fighting and marching. He resolved to stand and fight, give the Germans a bloody nose, and then slip away once they'd been halted.
The British positioned their 18-pounders up front, with the infantry on the fields outside Le Cateau, and waited for the Germans.
Commander Royal Artillery, General Headlam, was determined that the infantry should get the best support that they could from the artillery. One of his brigades was already well forward to support the rearguard brigade, and there was a morale effect of seeing the guns right forward and firing directly over the heads of the infantry.
At the front, the 18-pounders were exposed, but supported by the other brigades on the fields to the west. Both sides had similar weapons, but in different quantities.
The German gun, field gun, was not as good as the British gun. It didn't have as high a rate of fire, and with a smaller shell, it wasn't as lethal. But with shields fitted to their own guns, the British gunners reckoned that they could withstand an attack by the German field guns. The howitzers, on the other hand, were a different matter. Most of their ammunition was high explosive, and that could do a lot of damage to both the guns and, of course, to the gunners themselves.
German howitzers hidden behind the ridge were in a good position to attack the British 18-pounders. Out in the open, these British guns could shoot straight at the advancing enemy troops.
But as the German infantry came over that crest line in front of us, they were subject to a storm of shrapnel from the British batteries, which would just cut down whole platoons at a time. The specific purpose of the 18-pounders was to attack the German infantry and to stop them getting close to our own infantry. And as far as that was concerned, they were remarkably successful.
Fred Lloyd was 17 when he first worked with the 18-pounders.
It was the best there was at that day, that time of day. I expect today they'd say it was rubbish. But it done its job, didn't it? We was 8-1. It was 8-1 against us. So, like that, we done a marvellous job, you know.
What really did for them was the high explosive fire by the German howitzers. This would destroy the guns. As the morning wore on, one gun after another was destroyed and the gunners forced to take refuge.
The British 18-pounders were losing. Their direct fire strategy put the gun out in the open, making them easy targets. And it also caused further complications.
Every gun had got an ammunition wagon, which was parked up next to it, which gave about 1,000 rounds of firing for the batteries. But once that started to run out, they then needed to bring ammunition limbers forward in order to replenish the ammunition supplies.
Bringing horse-drawn supplies forward under fire was a deadly undertaking. Without ammunition, the guns were forced to retreat.
Saving the guns at Locato became another sort of iconic, heroic failure, which a lot of people enjoy talking about as some kind of a success. Actually, it was a disaster.
One battery captain was so annoyed at having to leave 2 of his guns behind that he actually gathered a team of volunteers together and went back right under the noses of the Germans and managed to snatch one of the guns away from them while the other team was shot down.
In one day, the British lost 38 field guns and thousands of men. The battle had proved that the German strategy of using concealed guns and indirect fire was the tactic of future warfare. For this, the howitzer was the gun of choice.
Certainly from that point of the First World War onwards, the guns, as far as possible, were always deployed in cover behind the infantry positions and not out in the open.
The introduction of indirect fire changed the whole geometry of the battlefield. Suddenly, guns anywhere in your own battlefield area could now engage enemy targets anywhere in their area. And that Battle of Locato, more than anything else, crystallised the debate about direct and indirect fire, guns versus howitzers. And the practice of artillery in the First World War would never be the same again.
In 1914, the German howitzer had put the British 18-pounder in its place. But the British had produced more 18-pounders than any other artillery gun, and with the war just beginning, they would have to change their use and tactics. Machine gun fire had driven the troops into trenches. The mobile war that everyone had expected came to a halt. Armies would fight from the trenches for the next 3.5 years. In order to deal with trench warfare, the 18-pounder needed a new strategy and new ammunition.
What was actually required was a high explosive round with a point detonating fuse, which would break up and damage the trenches in which the troops were hiding. So the role of the high explosive shell became critical for the rest of the war, and a high explosive shell for the 18-pounder was soon introduced.
The high explosive shell works quite differently to the shrapnel shell in that it has a solid steel body, quite a heavy steel body, filled internally with a very powerful explosive, normally fused to function on impact, although that wasn't essential, and the high explosive inside here shattered the shell case completely into thousands of quite small pieces, projecting them at quite a high speed, and the shell body therefore became the killing bit. We're looking at a tremendous bang, we're looking at quite a powerful shockwave, we're looking at a lot of damage, we're looking at it lifting a lot of soil, we're looking at it, taking bodies apart, and men being injured, killed. buried, and then the next HE shells lifting them up again and throwing bits of body around. Quite a horrendous scene altogether, quite unpleasant.
In World War I, the development of artillery battles created a new kind of deadly warfare. At the Battle of Verdun, France in 1916, soldiers saw and heard over 1 million shells falling in the first day. The psychological impact was devastating. 80,000 men suffered from shell shock during the 4-year war. It crippled them emotionally and physically. This acute psychiatric disorder froze soldiers in the trenches, made them blind, deaf, or insane. In 1916, the horrors of shell shock and trench warfare were felt on both sides. For the gunners of the British 18-pounders, the trenches were causing additional problems. The 18-pounders' new explosive shells were not getting into the enemy trenches. To give it a higher trajectory, the gunners buried the rear of the gun into the ground, but this tactic never really worked. The howitzer was the gun designed for indirect fire. With the 18-pounders firing in the indirect mode, they now needed forward observers. By 1915, the battlefield had changed, stretching 2 miles from the rear to the front trench lines on both sides. The guns at the back had to fire over their own army at an invisible target. Indirect fire brought new tactics and technology to this 3-dimensional battlefield. Now the only way to locate your enemy precisely was with maps, forward observers, and all kinds of machines. The enemy was so far away that a forward observer could not simply climb the nearest tree or hill to see him. Telephones and megaphones were used to communicate on the ground, and spies were sent up in the air. Aerial reconnaissance in planes and balloons became the new way to get the best view of enemy targets. Forward observers were now key to winning the battle. But despite all their attempts, these orchestrated attacks were still fairly inaccurate.
The solution to this was to just fire lots and lots of ammunition, and you're bound to hit something. That explains, if you like, the great attritional battles of the Somme and Verdun. Lots of ammunition fired relatively inaccurately and also ineffectively because you didn't actually know where the critical targets were.
The noise, terrific. Do you know, before I joined up, we could hear guns across the channel from where I was working. We could hear them blundering away.
After battles such as Le Cateau, it was possible, by use of indirect fire, to engage simultaneously not only the enemy's front line from the outset, but also the enemy's commander, his logistics, his reserves, the routes by which the reserves would come to join the battle. And this has been the pattern of warfare ever since.
For indirect fire, the howitzer was superior. The 18-pounder had to adapt again. As a last resort, they took it off its wheels, pointed it at the sky, and made it an anti-aircraft gun. The howitzer had triumphed. It dominated the new modern warfare. 100 years later, the legacy of the German howitzer and the British 18-pounder lives on. The designs of today's light artillery guns still use the same basic technology. As World War I changed warfare on the ground forever, a new kind of battle was unfolding in the air. At the beginning of World War I, the aircraft was only 11 years old. But these new machines quickly found their niche. Fitted with cameras, they became spies in the sky, plotting artillery targets and troop movements. Neither side wanted their enemy to have this crucial intelligence. The solution was to replace the camera with a gun, turning passive airplanes into weapons with one purpose: to shoot down enemy aircraft. The Allies' greatest weapon in their battle for air supremacy was this plane, the Sopwith Airplane Company's Camel. King of the Allied fighters, it shot down more aircraft than any other fighter in World War I. This was Germany's response. From the Fokker Aircraft Company came the DR-1 triplane, the Camel's most famous rival. But which fighter was best at dominating the skies? To find out, the Fokker and the Sopwith are going back into the air. At the beginning of the war, enemy spotter planes were powerful weapons, the spy satellites of their age. Taking them down was an obvious military priority.
They didn't want them to be able to watch them maneuver, so they had to went up and tried to shoot them down.
But engaging in aerial combat was a brand new game, and pilots had no experience in how to bring down other airplanes. Targets that could be traveling at speeds as high as 100 miles per hour.
Pilots tried everything from trailing barbed wire along behind the aeroplane to carrying duck guns, pistols, rifles. All of them were very difficult to aim, didn't have a killer effect when they got there, and weren't very effective in taking out other aircraft.
In one instance, there is some evidence to suggest that a pilot took to lobbing half bricks at his opponent in an effort to actually hit the pilot and incapacitate him.
They needed a focused weapon, a flying machine gun to reliably down the enemy. With the birth of the fighter plane, a furious arms race quickly developed. Soon the air was filled with these flying guns. For the reconnaissance crews fighting this new kind of war, the skies turned deadly.
The one that shot us down, he come out of the sun. Every third bullet was a tracer bullet. You could see him coming like this, and you think, oh, the next one must hit me. And, of course, bullets had hit the engine. So we just sailed down like this, looked for a nice field, landed on the field, hit a ditch, and over we went.
Fighters were the only way to protect reconnaissance aircraft. Slow and stable, they made easy targets. To get to these spy planes, opposing fighters would have to battle it out with each other first.
In order to attack the reconnaissance aircraft and shoot them down to blind the enemy, we're going to have to fight our way through the enemy fighters who are protecting them.
The measure of a fighter's ability would be how good it was at shooting down enemy fighters. The power of these fighters' weapons were vital to its success in World War I. But both sides had equally good machine guns, so air supremacy was decided by the performance of the aircraft. Pilots won battles with a fighter that had superior speed, could climb fast, turn fast, give better visibility, and respond quickly.
You want the aircraft to react instantaneously to any kind of input that you make to either the stick or the throttles or the rudders in order to maneuver as aggressively and as rapidly as you can in order to get your nose on for that first shot opportunity in a visual flight.
Did the Allied Sopwith Camel or the German Fokker triplane best combine these sometimes conflicting requirements in order to produce the more aggressive and deadly fighter? The difference between success and failure came down to aircraft design. A well-designed fighter could give a combat edge simply by being harder to shoot down and therefore less vulnerable. It's a major consideration for all fighter pilots.
Vulnerability is something that we do not want to have. We want, obviously, the enemy to be more vulnerable than us. And we do that nowadays through modern technology, through stealth technology, and taking advantage of computer technology, incorporating that into our missiles and our radars.
Stealth technology and computers weren't available in World War I, but the designers at Fokker found their own ingenious alternative that solved a fundamental flaw in the traditional airplane designs, like the British Sopwith Camel. The Camel used the same basic technology as the Wright brothers, relying on a complex network of bracing wires to hold the aircraft together. Simply shooting them away could destroy the plane.
The bracing wires on the Sopwith Camel were very important because they gave it its structural strength. The problem is the enemy was able to shoot them with machine guns and break them, and once they broke them, obviously the aircraft structurally just disintegrated.
The Fokker Company's World War I equivalent of stealth technology was a new wing that didn't need the exposed bracing wires at all, making the German Fokker harder to shoot down than the Allied Camel.
Big advantage is kind of like armor, same type concept. It hardened the aircraft, or it made it less vulnerable to enemy attack. So it could take battle damage, essentially.
In terms of vulnerability, the Fokker is superior. The Camel's wire-framed wings made it an easier target than the futuristic wire-free wings of the Fokker. But to claim victory, being less vulnerable was not enough. A winning fighter clearly had to perform better in the air. And one of the most critical advantages a fighter can have is a better rate of climb. In an aerial battle, a height advantage over the enemy could be decisive.
If you've got altitude, you have got much better visibility, and you've got speed. If you can see the other guy underneath you, you peel off, you go into a dive, your speed goes through the roof. You are coming down at a rate of knots. The ideal was you come down on the tail where he can't see you, get underneath, come up, and rake the belly of the aeroplane with machine gun fire. And the guy doesn't even know what killed him.
Once again, the Fokker is superior. With more wings than the Camel, it generates more lift, so it can climb faster. In fact, even though it's called a triplane, the Fokker didn't stop at 3 wings. There are technically 4, known as aerofoils.
It's often referred to as a quadruplane. The actual aerofoil section between the axles is actually calculated in the lift area of the wings. And so it just provides quite a fair amount of lift off that aerofoil section. Yeah, so that's its 4th wing.
The 4 wings on Germany's Fokker DR-1 triplane generated an astonishing amount of lift, giving it a climb rate nearly 1.5 times as fast as the Allied Camel. Its sturdy design and faster climb rate were critical advantages for the Fokker in a dogfight, but not nearly enough to ensure victory. Because if a pilot wanted to stay on the tail of an enemy aircraft and shoot him, his aircraft would have to be more maneuverable. To accomplish this, the best fighter aircraft had to sacrifice stability, the plane's tendency to fly straight and level, for better maneuverability. It's vital to get this balance between stability and instability just right.
With a fighter aircraft, you want it as unstable as you possibly can so that it has the ability to maneuver very quickly, but not so unstable that it becomes out of control.
This trade-off is still applied to the designs of the most sophisticated fighters in the air today.
Nowadays, if we look at the fly-by-wire control, the aircraft are so unstable that without the input of a computer to control the aileron and the flying surfaces, those aircraft would not be able to fly.
To make an aircraft stable, designers rake the wings upwards. This upward angling is called dihedral and can clearly be seen on the bottom wing of the Camel. If the plane rolls, the wing going downward generates more lift than the wing going upwards, which tends to right the aircraft, making it more stable. Compare this with Germany's Fokker DR-1. Its wings are absolutely straight, with no dihedral and no inherent stability, making the Fokker a very maneuverable fighter, but like many of the greatest fighters, a very twitchy machine to fly.
It's a bit like balancing a billiard ball on the end of a billiard cue. So you constant jostle all the time when you're flying the aeroplane. A little bit like flying a helicopter, whereas if you take your hands off the controls, it'll just wander off straight away, and you've got to pick it up again. So it's an airplane that you don't take your hands off it. Yeah, if you do, well, things happen very quickly.
This instability or twitchiness made the Fokker a more dangerous dogfighter than the Sopwith Camel, if the pilot flying it had enough aggression and skill. The Germans may have thought that the Camel's position looked hopeless. But in the regular dogfights between these two planes, the Camel had its own answers to the Fokker's technical edge. In World War I, Germany's Fokker DR-1 triplane may have seemed to have had the Allied Sopwith Camel beaten hands down. But for all its technical advantages, it was weak in a key area of fighter design: visibility. The Fokker's technical edge relied heavily on its unusual three-winged layout, and it was these very same wings that impaired visibility.
In the case of the Fokker triplane, the pilot has serious difficulty in actually seeing past the wings when he's trying to work out where aircraft he's fighting are. And of course, failing to see your enemy can be an absolutely fatal problem.
The two wings on the Camel were sighted wide apart, well out of the pilot's line of sight, making it easier to target the enemy and harder for the Fokker to sneak up on him. And if the Fokker pilot survived combat with the Camel, his problems with visibility were not over. The Fokker could be fatal to its own pilot without any help from the enemy. It was so difficult to land that doing so could actually be more hazardous than fighting in the skies. As the tail comes down, the wings block the view ahead completely.
When you're landing this airplane, it's a bit like closing a Venetian blind in front of you, and it's exactly that, because not only do you close your field of view, you're also closing off the airflow over the tail surfaces. And the moment the wings close in front of it, you can't steer it.
Visibility was so poor in the Fokker that it was one of the few aircraft that could not be landed looking straight ahead.
But often you can actually see where you're going in front. You can look out to the side and actually around behind you, actually see which way you're going.
The Camel's widely separated wings made the rudder very dependable, and the pilot could actually see where he was going during landing. This was a major advantage for the Camel. World War I landings and takeoffs were a hazardous business.
Landing and taking off in World War I were as dangerous, if not more so, than combat. They lost about the same number landing and taking off as they did actually in combat.
In or out of combat, visibility was always one of the Allied Camel's ace cards over the Fokker triplane. It gave Camel pilots a killing edge. By the time the German DR-1 and the Allied Camel arrived in the skies above Europe in 1917, more powerful airplane engines were pushing combat in the skies faster and higher. Both planes could top 100 miles per hour, and the combat ceiling had stretched to an altitude beyond 20,000 feet. Life for the pilots became increasingly difficult.
I have a great deal of respect for the World War I pilots. They were such a simple aircraft, open cockpits, no instrumentation, very little armor on the aircraft, no oxygen systems, cold environments in the open cockpit, flying in all kinds of weather conditions, flying at high altitudes without supplemental oxygen.
This thin air could be as cold as -40 degrees, making hypothermia just as deadly to World War I pilots as enemy aircraft.
We had silk socks, silk pants, silk undershirt, woolen socks, woolen pants, woolen shirt. Then you had your uniform trousers, coat, and then on top of that your flying suit, which was fur-lined. And even then, at 20,000 feet, you feel damn cold.
The improving engine performance, driving planes to these extreme altitudes, was also making them faster. And for fighters, being faster could make the difference between killing or being killed.
A speed advantage enables you to catch your opponent up if he's some distance ahead of you. It also, of course, means that you can disengage from your opponent relatively easily. A pilot's maxim for many years, from the middle of the First World War through to probably even the late 1960s, simply was speed is life. And that is why fighter pilots view speed as being so important.
But there was a problem. To go more quickly, aircraft have to push the air out of the way faster. The faster a plane goes, the harder this gets, an effect known as drag.
You can't get away from drag. Drag increases exponentially with speed. The faster you go, the more your drag becomes.
What this means is that going twice as fast needs 4 times the engine power, So the lower the drag, the faster the aircraft will go with a given engine. Unfortunately for Fokker, some designs start out with more drag than others. Long, slender wings make for less drag, but short, thick wings make a lot. The type of wings that make the DR-1 so maneuverable also slowed it down. And the more wings there are, the worse the drag problem gets, the slower your aircraft will be. Pitted against the Allies' two-winged Camel, drag killed the four-winged Fokker.
The Fokker DR-1 with the 3 wings, essentially 4, creates a lot of lift, so it climbs real well, as the Red Baron attested to. The problem is, it generates a lot of drag.
A Fokker triplane is a very draggy machine. You're very limited what you can do with that aircraft. You can put 1,000 horsepower on the front of an airframe, and you won't go any faster.
The most simple way of ensuring victory is to make sure that your opponent never sees you and you shoot him in the back. Nothing particularly chivalrous about it, but that's the simple way. Get in, hit the enemy, shoot him down, and get out of the way before someone does the same thing to you.
For the Germans, building a better dogfighter was not enough to secure an advantage. The Fokker DR-1 was crushed on speed as well as visibility. It simply could not control the fight. And as more powerful engines arrived, the Camel's aerodynamic advantage over the Fokker simply increased. It might seem like bad luck that the Fokker company fell victim to the limitations of triplane design. But the problems were certainly familiar to their rivals, the British designers at Sopwith. Because in 1916, they had made their own, the Sopwith triplane, affectionately known as the Tripe. This remarkable 3-winged plane had been so capable that it caught the attention of the German High Command, who demanded their own. But when the Fokker company laid down the plans for their first triplane, they made a fatal miscalculation.
Although they build the DR-1 as a result of the influence of the triplane, they do not actually use any captured examples or crashed examples to give them clues as to how they do this. They go off and build an aircraft very much of their own making.
Fokker designers clearly thought that 3 wings could give an advantage in aerial maneuverability. But that's not why the Sopwith triplane was so good. Its 3rd wing was actually intended to provide better visibility, one of the Fokker's biggest failings.
The theory, which seems amazing these days, was that they wanted better visibility. The Sopwith Pup was the immediate predecessor to the triplane. The triplane has the exact same wing area, but spread over 3 wings. And that meant that the width of the wing was 2/3 of the size of the Pup.
The thinner wings blocked less of the pilot's view, giving him more chance of seeing the enemy. Designers at Sopwith already understood that drag meant triplanes were a dead end, which is where the Camel came in.
Sopwith sees the triplane as being an answer to a problem that exists at a certain moment in time. They are already working on development of the aircraft that becomes a Sopwith Camel.
The German decision to build the DR-1 had not been made entirely on technical merit. In the end, it came down to the celebrity status of this man, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. With 80 kills to his credit, von Richthofen was a national icon, and his opinions were hugely influential.
He takes over the DR-1, likes the aircraft greatly, and because of the fact he's Germany's greatest fighter ace and a great national hero, the DR-1 takes on something of an image and a position in the German air service that it might not otherwise have gained.
Because of their beloved Red Baron, the Germans may have been seduced into living with the fundamental flaws of the DR-1. As World War I came to an end, the formula for winning the battle for the skies was becoming clear. If DR-1 pilots could not see the enemy, they could not shoot them down. And pilots in the faster Camel could decide when to fight and when to run. They had more chance of controlling the fight. And though the Fokker may have been marginally more maneuverable in a dogfight, its advantage was just not great enough.
If you put von Richthofen and a clone of von Richthofen into the DR-1 and a Sopwith Camel, My sneaking suspicion is that the von Richthofen clone flying the Sopwith Camel would probably win.
When all was said and done, the Camel was the greater fighter, and this is reflected in the number of planes built. Fokker made no more than 320 DR-1 triplanes, and when the war ended in November 1918, the DR-1 was out of the picture. British industry, on the other hand, built more than 5,700 Camels, and unlike the DR-1, when the dust settled at the end of the war, it was still a frontline fighter.